He ignored every call just to stay. Hello everyone, hope you're having a great day. Today, we're going to explore a quiet but powerful moment when Quang chooses Linda and their unborn child over the world that's calling him back. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. Morning arrived quietly, without ceremony. Light slipped through the narrow gap between the curtains, pale and hesitant, as if it wasn't sure it was welcome yet. It brushed the walls, the floor, the edge of the bed, never rushing, never demanding attention. The house remained still, wrapped in a silence that felt rare and fragile. Linda slept longer than she usually did. Her breathing was slow, uneven in a way Quang had begun to notice but couldn't yet explain. Not sick, not restless, just different. As if her body was adjusting to a new rhythm, one that didn't quite belong to her alone anymore. Quang lay beside her, awake. He hadn't moved for a long time. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, but his attention was entirely on the woman next to him, on the small rise and fall of her chest, on the faint tension in her shoulders, even in sleep, on the way one hand rested instinctively over her stomach, as if protecting something she couldn't yet see. There was a quiet weight in the room, not fear, not urgency, something heavier and gentler. Carefully, Quang shifted. He moved the way people do when they are afraid of disturbing something precious. One wrong sound, one careless motion, and the moment might break. He slid out of bed slowly, pausing when the mattress dipped slightly. Linda didn't wake. Only then did he allow himself to breathe fully. He dressed without turning on the lights, relying on memory rather than sight. His phone lay on the nightstand, dark and silent for now. He didn't pick it up. He didn't need to. In the kitchen, the morning felt unfamiliar. Quang stood still for a moment, hands resting on the counter, taking in the space. He had walked through this room hundreds of times before, but never like this. Never with the sense that what he did here mattered. This wasn't a meeting room. There were no deadlines waiting. No voices competing for control. Just quiet. He filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove. The sound of water moving felt unusually loud in the silence. He lowered the flame immediately, instinctively cautious, as if even the kitchen itself should remain gentle today. The doctor's voice echoed faintly in his mind. Warm water, light food, no rush, simple instructions, clear, yet somehow heavier than the most complex negotiations he'd ever handled. While the water heated, Quang washed fruit and cut it into uneven pieces. His hands weren't used to this kind of work. They were precise, yes, but in a different way. Used to signing documents, pointing at blueprints, gesturing during heated discussions. Still, he focused. Each movement slowed, each sound measured. For once, there was no clock pushing him forward. When the kettle clicked off, the sound made him flinch. He poured the water carefully, testing the temperature before setting the cup aside. He arranged everything neatly on a small tray, then stopped, looking at it as if unsure whether it was enough. He almost laughed at himself. Linda woke slowly. At first, she stayed still beneath the blanket, eyes half open, letting consciousness return at its own pace. Her body felt heavier than usual, as if gravity had increased overnight. A faint wave of discomfort passed through her stomach. Not pain, not nausea, just a reminder. Something inside her was changing. She sat up carefully, pressing one hand against the mattress for support. The house was quiet. too quiet. "Quang?" she called softly. "In the kitchen," he answered at once. She found him standing near the counter, holding a cup in both hands as if it required his full attention. When he turned and saw her, relief crossed his face so quickly he didn't have time to hide it. "You should have stayed in bed," he said. Linda smiled faintly. "I was thirsty." He handed her the cup. Their fingers brushed for just a second. Brief, accidental, but enough to make her pause. She wrapped both hands around the warmth and took a slow sip. "It's good," she said quietly. Quang nodded. The tension in his shoulders eased just a little. They sat together on the sofa, leaving a small space between them at first. Linda leaned back, letting the cushion support her. Quang sat upright, alert, watching her from the corner of his eye. "You don't have to stare," she murmured. "I'm not," he replied too quickly. She smiled and shifted closer, resting her head against his shoulder. The movement was careful, deliberate. Quang froze for a moment, then relaxed. His arm lifted instinctively, resting behind her, not pulling her in, just steady. The silence between them felt different now. Comfortable, earned. After a while, Linda reached for his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. There was no announcement, no dramatic pause, just a simple, natural motion. Quang's breath caught. He didn't move his hand away. "I feel strange," Linda said softly. "Not sick, just unfamiliar. Sometimes it scares me." He waited before answering. "What part scares you?" he asked. "That I won't recognize myself anymore," she said. "That I'll change so much, and you'll feel like you're living with someone else." Quang turned toward her fully. "Then we'll learn her together," he said, slowly. She studied his face, searching for doubt, for hesitation. She didn't find it. "I don't need you to fix anything," she whispered. "I just need you here." His answer came without pause. "I am." Later, exhaustion claimed her again. Linda fell asleep, curled against him, her breathing steady. Quang stayed exactly where he was. His hand rested over her stomach, warm and protective. He leaned closer, voice barely above a whisper. "We'll figure this out," he said, "one day at a time." The phone vibrated on the table. Once. He ignored it. It vibrated again. Quang glanced at the screen. A familiar name. A familiar pull. He looked back at Linda. The phone vibrated a third time. Quang turned it face down. For today, he chose to stay. The afternoon settled into the house the way dust does, quietly, without asking permission. The light shifted across the floor, stretching longer, softer. Morning had loosened its grip, but evening was still a promise waiting outside the windows. Time slowed, as if the world itself understood that nothing here needed to be rushed. Linda woke slowly. She stayed still at first, eyes closed, letting awareness return at its own pace. Her body felt heavy, not with pain, but with a strange fullness she was still learning to understand. The kind of exhaustion that didn't come from doing too much, but from becoming something new. Beside her, Quang hadn't moved. She could feel his presence before she saw him, the warmth of his arm, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his body seemed anchored to hers, as if leaving wasn't an option he'd even considered. She turned her head slightly and looked at him. In rest, Quang looked different, softer. The sharp lines that usually framed his face had eased, replaced by a quiet weariness he never showed the outside world. Linda realized with a sudden clarity how rarely he allowed himself to stop. Her hand drifted to her stomach. The motion was instinctive now, protective, familiar. It startled her how natural it felt, how her body had accepted this reality faster than her thoughts ever could. Somewhere between yesterday and today, her sense of self had begun to shift. Quang stirred. "You awake?" he murmured, voice low and rough with sleep. "Just now," she whispered. He opened his eyes and looked at her carefully, scanning her face the way he always did lately, as if searching for signs she might miss herself. "You feel all right?" he asked. She nodded. "Just tired." He didn't argue. Instead, he adjusted his position slightly, offering silent support rather than words. They stayed like that for a few moments longer, neither rushing to move. When Linda finally pushed herself upright, Quang rose immediately, staying close without hovering, ready without making it obvious. In the kitchen, the afternoon light made everything feel warmer. Quang reheated the soup he'd prepared earlier, stirring slowly, thoughtfully. Linda leaned against the counter, watching him in silence. There was something unfamiliar in his movements today. Less precision, less urgency, more care. "You're being very serious about this," she said softly. He glanced at her. "About what?" "About taking care of me." He shrugged. "Seems important?" She smiled, a small sound of amusement slipping out before she could stop it. They sat at the table together. Linda ate slowly, pausing between bites, listening to her body in a way she never had before. Quang noticed and adjusted his pace without comment, setting his spoon down when she did. "You don't have to match me," she said gently. "I'm not matching you," he replied. "I'm just here." That answer lingered with her. "You're different today," Linda said after a moment. "So are you." She nodded. "I've been thinking." "That usually means you're worried." "Maybe," she admitted. "I keep wondering how much of your life is changing because of me, because of this." She gestured toward her stomach. Quang followed the movement with his eyes. "You're not taking anything from me," he said carefully. "But I see what you're giving up," she replied. "The calls you're ignoring, the meetings you're not in." His gaze drifted to the phone lying face down on the table. "You didn't ask me to," he said. "I know," she answered. "That's what makes it heavy." Silence settled between them, thick but not uncomfortable. "I don't want you to wake up one day and feel trapped," Linda continued. "I don't want to be the reason you stop being who you are." Quang leaned back slightly, considering his words. "I spent a long time believing that if I stopped moving, everything would fall apart," he said slowly. "That my value came from being needed all the time." "And now?" she asked. He reached across the table and placed her hand over his chest. "Now I realize I've never actually listened to this before," he said. "I just kept drowning it out with work." Linda swallowed hard. Later that afternoon, Quang stepped onto the balcony alone. The city stretched out below him, alive and indifferent. Cars moved. Voices echoed faintly. Life continued at a pace he used to match instinctively. His phone vibrated in his hand, pulling at habits built over years. He looked at the screen. Missed calls. Messages stacked with urgency. For a moment, he closed his eyes. Inside the apartment, Linda stood near the window, watching without meaning to. She saw the tension return to his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened. She saw him inhale slowly, then slip the phone into his pocket. When he came back inside, she didn't ask. They spent the rest of the afternoon doing small, ordinary things. Folding laundry, rearranging shelves that didn't really need attention, sitting on the floor together, flipping through old photo albums. Linda paused at one picture of Quang from years ago. "You look so serious," she said. "I thought seriousness meant strength," he replied. Now I think it just meant I was afraid to stop. She leaned her head against his shoulder. This time, he leaned back. As evening approached, the light outside faded gradually. Quang turned on a single lamp, filling the room with warmth. Linda curled up on the sofa, fatigue returning quietly. "You should rest," he said. "I've been resting all day." "Then rest more." She didn't argue. Quang sat beside her, watching as sleep took her again. He brushed her hair back gently, then rested his hand over her stomach. The phone vibrated once more. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he leaned closer and whispered, barely audible, "I'm here." Not to the world outside, not to his work, but to the life unfolding quietly in front of him.
Xin chào mọi người. Trong tập này, Linda và bà Linda và Linda theo bà và cậu cháu ra nương mía. Dưới nắng sớm, bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa. Dậy à, chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO Quang ghé đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.